بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين والعاقبة للمتقين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على خير البرية سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته ومن اهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين. تركنا المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. ثم أما بعد. So alhamdulillah, we're here for the second session from the Seerah series, inshallah. The way we had originally divided it is the first two sessions we'll be dealing with the Meccan period from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Last week we did an introduction. We talked a little bit about the Arabian Peninsula and the tribe that he belongs to, Quraysh, and some of his early years, his birth, his blessed birth, and his early years as an orphan, and the time he spent with various people who cared for him, including his uncle and his grandfather and his uncle, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then his marriage to Khadija, radiallahu anha. So this session, inshallah, we will begin with the Wahi, or Bad al-Wahi as it's referred to, the beginning of revelation, when the Prophet ﷺ was in the mountain cave of Hira, Ghar Hira, and he was approached by the Archangel Jibreel, or Gabriel, alayhi salam. So at this point in his life, the Prophet ﷺ was just shy of 40 years of age, or about 40 years of age. I think we spoke last time when he was 35, 5 years before. He already grown to have quite a reputation amongst the Qurayshis, the people of Quraysh, who were the main tribe in Mecca, as being a very honest person. They used to refer to him as Al-Amin or Sadiq Al-Amin, the truthful one, the trustworthy one. They would leave their valuables with him. They would use him to intercede on their behalf when they had disputes, the most famous of which, when they disputed about who was to place the black stone, replace the black stone in the Kaaba after it was destroyed by flood. So the Kaaba was rebuilt, and then the sub-tribes, al-Butun as they're referred to, had an issue who would place the black stone in its place, because that was a very honorable thing. And whoever was to do it would be considered the most honorable of the sub-tribes. So it was a lot of prestige, status associated with that. And they almost came to actual physical battle warfare, drawing swords and so forth. Until one of the uqala, one of the more rational ones amongst them said, well, let's just fix this dispute by the first one who walks in, we'll let him figure it out. And it was none other than the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And so they were quite happy actually when he was the one that walked in, because they all trusted him in his judgment, and this reputation was already there. And so he very decisively and very intelligently, he had them draw a type of a square type of cloth or burda or blanket, and they put this black stone in the middle, and the four tribes carried the four corners, and then the Prophet ﷺ, he was the one to place it back in its place in the Kaaba. So no one can argue, no one can make the statement that the Prophet ﷺ was someone who was not liked by his people. Up until the time that he received the revelation, when he was 40 years of age, he was one from amongst the most honorable of the tribes, namely Quraysh, and he was from amongst the most honorable of the sub-tribes, namely Banu Hashim. So when he first received the revelation, it was his practice to retreat to Ghar Hira. And Ghar Hira is a mountainous cave area that's probably not more than a few kilometers from the Haram itself, from the Kaaba. And one of the distinguishing things about Ghar Hira especially is that, unfortunately I heard that today this is no longer the case, but before they built those towers, that one would be able to go up there and you would see the Kaaba from there. You would see the Haram. And so when the Prophet ﷺ, he wanted to maintain sight of the Kaaba. He would enter the Kaaba, and perhaps he would worship there, but the Kaaba was filled, or the Haram was filled with 360 idols. each group sort of placed an idol in there. They had some major idols like Walead, Uzza, Manat, Hubal, but there were many more than those that were there. And each idol was kind of like a sort of money maker for the respective sub-tribes. So people would go there and sacrifice things and make all sorts of things for the idol itself, but which the tribe who was sponsored the idol, so to speak, would be the main beneficiary. So that was a type of environment the Prophet ﷺ did not find himself very comfortable with. So he would retreat to the cave, the mountainous cave of Hira, to seek seclusion. So Aisha is the one who narrates the hadith about Bad al-Wahi, and she wasn't even alive at the time, Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha. But this was something that Prophet ﷺ related to her later on. So the idea that it was a very important event, obviously the beginning of the revelation, how did it all come about, is something that was important. So the Prophet ﷺ related it to Aisha. And just speaking of Aisha, incidentally, we find that she's one of the most prolific hadith narrators. She's in the top 3 with Anas ibn Malik and Abu Hurairah and Abdullah ibn Umar. And she was also a faqihah. She was one of the most learned of the Sahaba, not just the most learned female Sahabi, but most learned, unqualified, whether male or female. And so much of the deen that we know, much of the prophetic reports and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ are known on account of Aisha radiallahu anha. And in one of the reports, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, خُذُوا نِصْفَ دِينَكُمْ مِنْ هَذِهِ الْحُمَيْرَةِ. Take half of your deen from this person, this little red one, whatever that means, like a sort of term of endearment for Aisha radiallahu anha. So she relates what happens when he was in Ghar Hira. And she said, before Ghar Hira, the Prophet ﷺ for a period of 6 months would have these dreams, these nightly dreams, and then the next day, the events of the day would be exactly like the dream. So she said, مثل فلق الصبح, like the daybreak, as clear as daybreak. In other words, sometimes when you dream and you wake up, it's kind of like, kind of have bits and pieces of what happened in your dream, you're not really sure, but you kind of remember little things here and there. But for the Prophet ﷺ, in this period of 6 months, he saw in his dream, then the next day things would happen exactly like he saw. So this was a type of a premonition, or irhasat, as the ulama call it, irhasat, which were indicative of what was to come. So there was a type of preparatory period for the Prophet ﷺ. And then Ghar Hira, where he spent much time, as we said, in seclusion. He was able to see the Kaaba from there. He would spend days and sometimes even weeks before he would come down, get more provision from his wife Khadija, and then go back. And the word that was used by the Rawi in the hadith for what he would do up there is something called at-tahannuth. And tahannuth, they said, is ibadah, it's devotional acts مع الانقطاع أو مع الاعتزال أو مع العزلة. So worshipful acts, but also in seclusion. That means that even the idea of being in seclusion is a type of worship, it's a type of act. And the ulama, they say that especially in times of strife, in times of fitna, tribulation, that seclusion becomes sort of the solace, the refuge of the believers. That sometimes when all of this is too crazy, which it is, that you need to take a little break and take a step away, a step back. It's not supposed to be a permanent situation. The Prophet ﷺ said, "La rahbaniyya fil Islam." There's no monasticism in Islam, so we don't build monasteries and be in complete seclusion without, and give up society forever. Not that. But a type of physical detachment that can lead to what's more important, which is a spiritual detachment. So to be in the dunya, which you don't have a choice, but not to be of the dunya. The dunya is something that it's not in your heart. You may possess some of it, but it doesn't control you. You control it. That's the idea. So the Prophet ﷺ, early on in his career, he would go to Ghar Hira. And it happened that one time while he was there, and we can probably safely assume the Prophet ﷺ had some type of prayer that he was doing there that is similar to the way we pray now. Something that could have been along those sorts. Not exactly like it is, but he had some type of reflection, obviously, contemplation, and some type of ibadah, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one time while he was there, this man appeared in front of him, literally out of nowhere. So the angel Jibreel came in the form of a man. And angels are types of beings that can take different forms, one of them being a human form. The jinn also can do that, which are the other type of creature that shaitan is one of them. Shaitan himself took the form of a man once, which we're going to get to later in the Seerah, when the Quraysh chieftains were thinking about what they should do with the Prophet ﷺ and how they could get rid of this problem that came about. And so he came in the form of a man who came from a different area, from Najd. And the Archangel Jibreel is the angel of Wahy. He's the angel of revelation. So every prophet, whoever received revelation from God, was visited by Jibreel alayhi salam. And sometimes even non-prophets, like Sayyidah Maryam, if we go with the opinion that she wasn't a prophet, or there's another opinion that she was a prophet. But also, in a similar way, she had a similar experience to Muhammad ﷺ, that she was also in her secluded place. So Maryam alayhi salam, she was born to her mother, who was from the house of Ali Imran, or her father's house was Ali Imran, and the mother had made a vow that her newborn child would be a servant of the temple. And it turned out she was expecting a boy, but it turned out to be a girl, namely Maryam. So she maintained that vow nonetheless, and so she sent Maryam, and there it was that Zakaria was the one who looked after her, because Zakaria's wife was related to the mother of Maryam. Either it was, they were sisters, or it was aunt and niece. Two different opinions, but there was a relationship there. So he was the one who looked after Maryam. So she had like this staircase, as the reports go, that you have to go up, and it was a closed door, and she was by herself. There's no way anyone else can get in. So Jibreel also appeared out of nowhere, came to her. That's when she said, the Quran says that she said, إِنِّي أَعُوذُ بِالرَّحْمَنِ مِنْكَ إِن كُنْتَ تَقِيًّا. Right? I seek refuge from the Rahman, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you are a person of taqwa, because I don't know you and you came out of nowhere. And this is when he gave her basharaha, he gave her the glad tidings, the good news that she would be pregnant with kalimatun min Allah, the word of God, namely Jesus or Isa alayhi salam. So when Jibreel appeared to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, also he didn't know who that was. So he wasn't sure, even though it looked like a man, because he came out of nowhere. So Jibreel approached him and he said to him, "Iqra," read, recite. And the word qara'a in Arabic can mean read, can mean recite, but it actually has kind of a deeper meaning than that. Kind of means someone who's learned based upon their study, based upon reading and recitation. So it wasn't like he had a tablet in front of him and he said to the Prophet ﷺ, read this. That's not what happened. But he was saying iqra in the sense that read from what you have known or what you know from transmitted knowledge. Something that you either heard of or that you came across. And the Prophet ﷺ was unlettered, right? He did not read. Most of the Meccans did not read, were unlettered. They knew language very well. They were able to, even some of them, compose poetry, very eloquent poetry, but for those who didn't have a need to read, well, they didn't. The ones who did read were the ones who were the traders, who would have a need to sort of, keep a catalog of their inventories and to deal with transactions with other peoples, especially in the north and the south. In the north of Syria, which was a more developed civilization, and also in the south in Yemen, in Arabia Felix, also a more developed civilization. So there was some need to read and write. But for most of them, that wasn't really the case. So the Prophet ﷺ replied back, "Ma ana biqari." as we know. That I am not a reader, I'm not a reciter, I'm not someone who has transmitted knowledge that I can tell you something that I've written or read. And then it was at this point that Jibreel took him and brought him close to him. ضمه إليه, right? And then the Prophet ﷺ said, this happened حتى بلغ مني الجهد, until I felt like I was completely overwhelmed by what happened. And then he let him go. And then he asked the question a second time, اقرأ. And then he responded in the same way, ما أنا بقارئ. And then he grabbed him the second time. Then he let him go. Then he asked the question the third time, اقرأ, or command actually. And he said, ما أنا بقارئ. I am not one who reads or recites or can transmit from what I have learned. And then he let him go, grabbed him, then let him go. And then this is when the Jibreel said to him, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. So the first Quran that was revealed from Surah Al-Alaq, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. Read or recite or know or transmit knowledge in the name of the one who has created you. So one might ask, why did it have to go this way? Why couldn't the revelation have been sort of like what happened with other prophets, like Moses? Moses had an alwah. Quran says alwah, which means tablets. So when he went to the burning bush, he actually got those tablets that had some of the wahi. Other prophets, most of their revelation was based upon dreams, like Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he said to his son, إِنِّي أَرَى فِي الْمَنَامِ أَنِّي أَذْبَحُكَ فَانْظُرْ مَاذَا تَرَى. I see in my dreams that I slaughter you, so what do you think we should do? So this was also revelation. But here with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it was a direct confrontation, so to speak, between him and the angel, and there was this direct type of, what we'd say in Arabic, talaqqi, like him sort of dictating to him what the revelation is. This is important and is significant. And it's very significant also that the first word of the revelation, of the Muhammadan revelation, was iqra, which is read, which is something that means is based upon knowledge. So our religion is a knowledge-based religion. It's one based upon knowledge, one based upon reflection, on contemplation. All of these things came about and happened in Ghar Hira, and that very first night, which is said to have happened in Rabi' al-Awwal, on the same day as the birth of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. That's one opinion, which would mean that he first started getting the dreams 6 months earlier, which would be in Ramadan. The other opinion is that this was in Ramadan, wallahu a'lam. But the majority opinion is that the Prophet ﷺ was born and received the revelation and also died all on the same day, which would be the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal. So the idea, this particular order of the way that things happened and the way that the angel spoke to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is indicative of a kind of paradigm that has become very important in our Islamic tradition, namely that al-ilmu bit-ta'allum, that knowledge is by learning, which kind of sounds, you're all students here, most of you, right? It kind of sounds like very intuitive, of course. Knowledge is by learning. But by learning from those who are learned, and those who can give you something of that which you do know not. And this is a recurring theme that we see. Even the great prophet Musa, Moses alayhi salam, learned from someone who had something that he didn't know, namely Al-Abd al-Salih, the faithful servant, Al-Khidr, in Surah Al-Kahf. So the Prophet ﷺ receives the revelation in this particular manner, and there was even a physical aspect to it, where Jibreel held him close to him. And it said that that physical aspect is also important, because there was sort of like a spiritual transfer that happened at the same time, not just physical, it was significant. And the 3 times is also significant. And the Prophet ﷺ, being asked in that manner, even though Jibreel knew that the Prophet ﷺ was not the one who was going to recite. He knew that beforehand, obviously. But nevertheless, he asked him. That's a type of discipline, a type of training. So we're made up of nufus, we're made up of spirits and souls that can be trained, that can be changed, that can go from something that is even despicable, right, in its actions and in its mannerisms and its the way it treats others, to something that's incredible. That's really the amazing thing about Islam. The amazing thing about this religion is it can take someone who was a completely unapproachable type of person that no one wanted to be around, and all of a sudden they can be someone that the best of mankind. And our souls have that capability. No one is beyond redemption. No one. You think of the worst person you can think of, they're not beyond redemption. There are people much worse than what you're thinking of who were saved, who woke up, who found a type of transformation in Islam. So after the Prophet ﷺ receives this revelation and Jibreel departs, Prophet ﷺ wasn't sure what exactly happened. What was that just happened? Was that a person? Was that an angel? Was that some type of kahana or soothsayer? These are the things that might have run through his mind. So he went back to Khadija radiallahu anha, and he explained to her what had happened, and then he also mentioned to her, Zammiluni, cover me up, which was the custom of their time when someone went through some type of traumatic experience, because it was definitely traumatic. He said, cover me up so I can recover. And he explained the story. And what was the reaction of Khadija radiallahu anha? She didn't say, well, that's the craziest thing I ever heard. I don't think, maybe you should stop going up there. Maybe you're seeing things, maybe your kids. She didn't say any of that. What she said to him, radiallahu anha, is, مَا يَخْزِيكَ اللَّهُ أَبَدًا. Allah will not forsake you ever. You are a type of person, تَحْمِلِ الْكَلْ وَتُقْسِي الْمَعْدُومِ. She mentioned a few things of character that he does. Right? You take other people's burdens, you feed people, you help orphans, people ask you for help, you give them help. So she said that someone like that, Allah doesn't forsake. So she looked at his character, at the type of man he was, the type of person he was. That's the type of person Allah does not forsake. How did she know that? By observation. She knew that such a person would not be forsaken by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, what happened to him was bisharat khair. It was a good sign, not something that was seen as a punishment. So perhaps she felt that this was not enough to convince the Prophet ﷺ. So she made a suggestion that they go to a cousin of hers, a man by the name of Waraqah ibn Nawfal. And she talked about Waraqah, and she said that he is someone who became Christian, تنصر في الجاهلية, during the time before the revelation of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And he was someone well versed in Hebrew, because she said that he used to write the Gospels in Hebrew. So he knew that language, and he was someone who was well read. It's not clear whether he actually was part of a greater group of Christians who might have been living in the peninsula, or he was someone kind of a wayfarer who read the Gospels in Hebrew, had some access to it, and kind of accepted it for himself. Allahu A'lam. I tend towards the latter. I don't think there was a type of monastery and a type of organized Christianity there. There's no evidence for that in the Arabian Peninsula, but rather that he was someone who kind of, because there were people like that, and they were called Hunafa. So the Hanif was someone who was looking for the original religion of Abraham, because the idolaters would say, no, this is Abraham's religion, he wants us to do this. That's the type of corruption that happened to the religion. So they kind of claimed that they're following Abrahamic faith, but in fact that they were not. So there were people who recognized that this wasn't the real deal, that can't be it. People like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq also was considered one of the Hunafa, Hanif, and Waraqah ibn Nawfal. These were people who didn't worship idols, who weren't convinced of this. And so they tried to maintain at least a sort of simple monotheism that doesn't have any idol worship associated with it. So she said, let's go to Waraqah ibn Nawfal, he's my cousin, and he's read a lot, so perhaps we can get something from him. So they go there, and she goes with him. And she said to Waraqah, Isma' min ibn akhik, listen to your nephew. Right? She didn't say listen to your son, in order to say, listen to your brother. Waraqa was much older, but at the same time, for the maqam of the Prophet ﷺ to say your son would have been something that's not appropriate. So she used the right words to describe the situation. And then she let the Prophet ﷺ explain what had happened. Waraqa, upon hearing the story, he said, this namus, right, this indication of good is what namus means, of khair, is the same thing that came to Musa, to Moses alayhi salam. In other words, this is prophecy, this is prophethood. That's what's happening here. Nothing. That's what he recognized. And he said, I wish that when this matter is completed with you, that I would be there to help you when your people exile you from where you are. A rather amazing thing that he said, kind of confusing at the same time, because the Prophet ﷺ responded back. He said, "Oh, mukhrajiyahum." He said, they're going to exile me? And Waraqa responded back quite, definitively, like he had no doubt. He said, nothing comes like this, what has come to you, except his people will try to exile him, will make him leave. They will not accept it readily. And then at the end of the hadith, it wasn't much later that Waraqa died, before the next revelation came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So most of the ulama say that Waraqa was a Muslim by definition, because he accepted that what happened to the Prophet ﷺ was revelation. Even though he's considered from what's called Ahl al-Fatra, which are the people between prophets, who are not taken into account for their belief or lack thereof, because they don't have guidance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We don't take anyone to account until we send a messenger. So someone who doesn't have either, because they live in a time period where there was no messengers particular to them, or they live in a time there are messengers but they're far away and never received the da'wah, then they're not held accountable. That's the belief of Ahl Sunnah. So after this, there was a period, the ulama called Fatrat al-Wahi, where the revelation stopped. So he received those first three initial ayahs, اقرأ بسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ ربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم. Those first few ayahs, and then after that, it stopped. Some say 2.5 years, up to 3 years, some say a few weeks. Most likely it's on a number of years, 2.5 years. So imagine that the Prophet ﷺ received that first revelation, and then 2 years go by, another 6 months, and nothing after that. Nothing happened. Until the Prophet ﷺ, he describes, he was walking on his way, and he saw Jibreel in his true form. And it's said that the only prophet ever to see Jibreel in his true form was the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. All the other prophets saw him in the form of a man, if he appeared to them. But he saw him in his true form, so he looked up to the horizon, to the sky, and he filled it. He filled the whole horizon, from the ground to the sky. Something like 600 pairs of wings, as he looked at him in the sky. So he saw him in his true form. And then he received the next revelation. يَا أَيُّهَا الْمُدَّثِّرُ قُمْ فَأَنذِرْ. So the one who has been wrapped up, قُمْ, stand, فَأَنذِرْ. Nidara means to warn, to forewarn. Right? The Quran describes the Prophet ﷺ as nadhiran wa bashira, as both a warner and one who gives glad tidings, good signs to those who follow him. But no one is Muslim yet at this point. So he's being told, قُمْ فَأَنذِرْ. Rise and begin your da'wah, begin your mission. So the beginning of the da'wah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was one that was surreptitious. Surreptitious means silent, yani secret. So the secret part is generally meant to have lasted about 3 years. So we have 2.5 years from the time he received the initial da'wah, then another 3 years on top of that, where it was a secretive of da'wah. And the first person to believe in him was Khadija, radiallahu anha, who already had accepted this from before. But now he had been given the command to actually actively preach, to actively tell people. So that was actually the beginning of the Risala. Right, because the ulama of theology, they say that there's a difference between a prophet and a messenger. So a prophet is someone who receives revelation, while a messenger is one who not only receives it, but then is ordered to convey it. Is commanded to convey it by God, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one could make the argument that in those first 2.5 years, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was prophet, not quite messenger yet. And then when he was given the command by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to begin to convey this message, he became a Rasul, a messenger. So he started with people he knew well, people of his household. And within his household he had a few people. He had Khadija radiallahu anha, who was his only wife at the time. She was the first to accept Islam. And then the second was generally accepted as Ali. Sayyidina Ali was living, Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was living with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The reason for this is that years back before that, Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had 4 boys: Talib, Aqil, Ja'far, and Ali, in that order. And there was 10 years age difference between each of them. So Ali, being the youngest, was 10 years younger than Ja'far, who was 10 years younger than Talib, who was 10 years younger than Aqil. And Abu Talib was not a man of a lot of material means. He was a very well-respected man, being from a very well-respected tribe, but he didn't have a lot of means. So the Prophet ﷺ proposed to Al-Abbas, who was another uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, that they should relieve Abu Talib a little bit. So one should take one of the sons, the other takes the other of the sons. So the Prophet ﷺ took Ali, and Abbas took Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, radiallahu anhum. So Ali was more or less a member of the household. And the Seerah, it mentions that he saw the Prophet ﷺ leading Khadija in prayer. They were praying together. And he saw that. He was only about 8 years old. And he asked the Prophet ﷺ what that was. And he said, you know, this is, I'm a messenger of Allah, and this is a prayer that we do. And he actually invited Ali to Islam at that point. So one narration of the Seerah says that he said, well, I have to see and ask my father, Abu Talib, about what he thinks about this. So the Prophet ﷺ was cautious, because he didn't want this idea to be in the public realm just yet. So he told him, I prefer either you accept it or you stay silent about it, and you don't tell anybody else about it. So Sayyidina Ali slept on it, 8-year-old boy. And when he said, I'm with you. So he followed the Prophet ﷺ, and he became the youngest Muslim at the time. Also in the household of the Prophet ﷺ was Zayd. At that point he was known as Zayd ibn Muhammad, because the tabanni, or the adopting someone as being as a son, was not made, the ruling from the Quran didn't come yet. He's actually Zayd ibn Haritha. That was his father. And even his father had come to town before then, or later on, and Zayd was given the choice to go with his father or stay with the Prophet ﷺ. He chose to stay with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So he was a servant of the Prophet ﷺ, and he also accepted Islam. And then the 4th person was someone who was a very close friend of the Prophet ﷺ, someone he had knew from his early days in Mecca, a man by the name of Abu Bakr ibn Quhafa, Siddiq, which would be his nickname later on. So at this point, the da'wah was sirri, it was secret, and the Prophet ﷺ would only approach people that he had a reasonable idea that they might be interested in Islam. So one might say, why did he do that? Why couldn't he just, start from the very beginning? And he could have went out and, made a fan page on Facebook and say, I'm the Prophet ﷺ, and, go out to the top of the mountain and that people can hit like and he can get a lot of followers that way. Why did he go about this way? Why was it a secret way? Especially for 3 years. Isn't this the haqq? Isn't this the truth? Why should we be shy about it? We should tell people. People should know. People should, get some, avail themselves of this good. Herein is a very important lesson. Everything the Prophet ﷺ did in his life, the way he went about doing things, there's a wisdom behind it. And that wisdom is that he was leaving something for posterity, something for us to follow. If you look to the individual actions of some of the Sahaba, you might at first glance think, wow, that seemed like more brave, or that seemed more courageous, or that seemed this. Umar, when he made hijrah, he went out to the Kaaba and he said, and he told all of Quraysh, I'm going to hijrah, I'm going to Medina today, and anyone who wants to try to stop me can meet me behind the mountain. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ said, he took the wrong route, he went south instead of north to throw them off, and then he stayed for 3 days, and then he hid in the cave, and then he took the sea route, he didn't take the normal route, and then he had a guide with them, and then he waited. He did all these things in his hijrah that you would say, well, is Umar more courageous? Why couldn't he do it? Like, no, he's not. But he's musharra'. He is leaving for us his sunnah. And the sunnah is the most moderate, balanced way of life conceivable. There is no more balanced way of life. Yes, there will be individual actions that would seem to seemingly outdo the sunnah. But they don't outdo the sunnah. Because remember, the Prophet ﷺ, he is leaving for something that we can actually take to heart and follow. We are inspired by some of the things the Sahaba did, like Umar or Abu Bakr, who gave all of his wealth away and left nothing behind. But we are not bound to those individual acts of piety, though we get inspired by them. What we are bound to is the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So his approach in the da'wah means that there's an approach. That you have to consider 3 things: ad-da'i, the one who's doing the da'wah; al-mad'u, the one you are giving the da'wah to; wal-mad'u ilayhi, what are you inviting to? Right? And so the approach that he took was not because he was afraid. It's not about fear. It's about using wisdom. It's about assessing the situation and seeing what is the best way to get to the hearts and minds of these people I'm trying to invite. And not so much invite to Islam, but invite to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inviting them to Allah, what is the best way I should go about doing it? Would a full-scale campaign right at the beginning be the best way? Or maybe it's more wise to build a core of believers with you who will also act as emissaries, as du'at, in addition to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which is the approach that he took. So that means for us that we can also consider these things, right? And it's not about valor and courage and bravery and, beating our chest and having the requisite dawah table in Penn Station and passing out pamphlets. I'm not disagreeing with that. People can do that. But it doesn't have to be like that. The dawah itself is flexible. There's flexibility in the approach that we can take and how we can go about inviting people. And we see this in the career of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He took different approaches with different people. So those closest to him, he took this particular approach. So during these 3 years, he also, probably the number of believers that they reached at the end of 3 years was something about 40 people, 40 men and women. And they would meet in this house of Dar al-Arqam ibn Abi Arqam, one of the early Sahaba. Again, surreptitiously, no one knew about it. It was very secretive. And so when the Sahaba would pray in this early period, they would pray, again, the prayer that they did may not be exactly like the prayer that came later during the Isra and Mi'raj, when prayer was made obligatory, but there was a type of prayer. Because prayer is mentioned in Surah Al-Muzammil. When it says, قُمِ اللَّيْلِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا نِصْفَهُ أَوْ أَنْقُصْ مِنْهُ قَلِيلًا. Right, so it's saying stand the night, which means stand the night in prayer. So there was a type of prayer. So they would pray, no one could see them, not out loud. They definitely didn't have like a type of tawaf around the Kaaba that everyone would see them as a group. So it was all very secret in the beginning. Until 3 years later, when the Prophet ﷺ received the command from the Quran, Surah Al-Hijr, فَاصْدَعْ بِمَا تُؤْمَرْ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. So, فَاصْدَعْ بِمَا تُؤْمَرْ means now be definitive in what you have been commanded to do. In other words, have an open da'wah. Invite everybody. And this was after they were about 40 people. So one of the first things the Prophet ﷺ did is that he went to many of the Quraysh and he assembled them. And in the hadith it says he stood on sort of a top of a hill, small mountain, and he said, you know me, you know who I am. If I told you that there was an invading army coming from the other side of this mountain coming to invade us, would any of you not believe what I was saying? And they said, أبدا ما جربنا عليك الكذب. Of course we believe you. You never lie in your whole life. ما جربنا عليك الكذب. We never see you lie, ever. So then he said to them, well, if that's the case, then what if I told you that I am a prophet sent from God and to tell you to worship the one true God and to forsake your idols and to so forth? They didn't like that. They said, no, يعني سفهت أحلامنا وعيبت أصنامنا. You know, you ruined our dreams and you're sarcastic with our idols and you made fun of them and you ridicule our idols and so forth. And these are our traditions. These are the things that we inherited from our forefathers, from our fathers and our grandfathers. You know, how can you go, it's not honorable to be disrespectful to one's ancestors. So they use a type of theme that sounds kind of reasonable, right? To have respect for one's heritage and one's forefathers and parents and things like this. But they use that to justify their worship of idols and not accept the message of Muhammad ﷺ. So one of the most vehement people against him on that day was actually his own uncle, Abu Lahab. And Abu Lahab said, remember, Abu Lahab is the same person who was so happy when the Prophet ﷺ was born that he freed Thuwayba, who was the first nursing mother of the Prophet ﷺ. But when this came about, he couldn't accept it. He felt it was a big affront to all of the things that they had inherited from their forefathers. There was another verse that was also revealed, more or less the same time, وَانذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ. And forewarn عَشِيرَتَكَ, your ashira, which means your family, your close tribesmen, the ones who are closest to you. With the verse that came before it, فَاصْدَعْ بِمَا تُؤْمَرْ, which was a general pronouncement, a general commandment to command everyone to the faith, but now also something specific for the people around you. So one might ask, why did the verse have to come like that? Isn't it enough that the general ayah was there? Why do we need something more specific saying that he should warn his family members? And he actually went to them. He assembled his family members, even the people of his household, including his daughters and his wife Khadija and everyone. And he said, مَا أُغْنِي عَنْكُم مِّنَ اللَّهِ شَيْئًا. You know, I cannot help you except if that you accept this da'wah, this message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, herein there's a reason for it, there's a wisdom behind it. Namely, even in our da'wah, right, is that we should, the ones who are closest to us have the most rights upon us. Whether it be family members, whether it be neighbors, whether it be the ones in your circle of friends or circle of acquaintances, all of these people have more rights than the one who is further away. So, al-aqrab bil-ma'ruf, the one who is closest to you. And the closest to you is your own self, your own soul. And so one of the pillars of da'wah is you're not going to be successful with anyone else unless you're successful with yourself. So if you're trying to change society, trying to change people, but yet you fail to change yourself, your da'wah will not be successful, will not work. The first step is changing yourself. The first step is putting in yourself the attributes, the character that you would like to see in other people. The thing that you're inviting to, you have to embody that, or at least try to, in yourself. I'm not saying that you have to be perfect and that you have to be, prophet-like in everything for you to be someone engaged in da'wah. but you should be striving to do so. You should be at least trying to be on a path where you're doing that, and not just merely dismiss it out of turn and say, well, that's not that important. It's important we get these people to come to Islam, to know about Islam, and so forth. But they may come to know about Islam more via your own actions, more via your own dealings with them, your mannerisms, than they come from anything you have to say. And people recognize that. People will see someone whose words don't really go along with what with their actions. It's kind of a turn off. They run away from that. So, حقق هذا, embody it, realize it within yourself, and at the same time, you're active in trying to invite people to what we believe to be the only way for them, the only successful way. Right? And again, as we said before, the da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ was one that was inviting people. So, this claim of the Quraysh that we have our traditions and so forth, and we don't want to leave our traditions, and it's wrong and so forth, and the honorable thing to do is to follow one's parents and forefathers. How do we reconcile that with what some people claim also when we say we have an Islamic tradition? And we say that we also have, many of you who are born into Islam, learn to pray, you watch your parents pray, or grandparents or family members, and kind of your Islam is based upon what you actually inherited from your parents. Here we are, the Prophet ﷺ is taking to task these people who are making the claim that they're just merely following, and the Quran as well, and Allah, obviously taking them to task for saying that they're following their traditions. So how do we understand all that? One thing the ulama of theology, of Aqidah, they said about Islam, and it's understood with the verse La ikraha fi din, right? There's no compulsion in religion, means that even if one is compelled in that, it's not acceptable. So there's no sort of just blind following, or just merely following someone in terms of acts of belief. And I say acts of belief because it's an act. I'm not saying what praying or fasting. I'm talking about acts of the heart, right? And the heart is the one thing that it won't lie to you. Because what's going on in here is the real thing. You may say all different things outside to people, and the way you act and the way you talk and things like that. But what's going on in here, that's the truth. And so no one can compel that. No one can compel another's heart. No one can make you love who you love. No one can make you dislike who you dislike. It's not possible. They can maybe have some effect, they can compel you in your outward actions, but what's going on in your heart, no one owns that. In fact, you don't even own it, right? Because sometimes you like things or dislike things or love people that you don't want to love, but nevertheless, somehow you love them. So you don't even really have control over that. So, this religion is based upon understanding, it's based upon contemplation, it's based upon your own conviction. Whether you're born into Islam or you came to Islam, either way, there has to have come a day, or there will come a day where you're going to decide for yourself that this is the type of person I want to be, this is the path I want to follow. Even though you may have been sort of initiated into Islam because of you have been blessed and being born into the religion, but there will come a day when you're a young adult or later where you say to yourself, you know what, I'm convinced of this path for myself. I want it for myself. Or I don't want it. And that's kind of, many parents, this is where they're a little bit nervous about, and anxious. Especially when they send their kids away to school and they don't know what they're doing every day, right? They want to know, this is the first time they're outside of the house, I don't know the daily activities, what's going on, are they with the right people, are they praying, are they doing this, are they not doing that? All these things that they're worrying about. Because they invested a lot in you guys. From the very beginning, all their hopes, their aspirations, their dreams is that you turn out to be the type of people that they wish you would be. But everyone makes their own decision at the end of the day. Right? The most the parents can do is kind of guide, direct, but they can't compel. Right? Because if we say, La ikraha fi din, there's no compulsion in religion, that means even parents can't compel, grandparents can't compel, uncles, aunts. No one can compel you to believe. to believe this is the path that's for you. You have to decide that for yourself. You can take steps, right, to learn about it, to make an informed decision. But at the end, you have to do it yourself. So that's why, in a general sense, we don't talk about following the mere tradition or going by just what our parents or grandparents said. Because even within Islamic societies, there are certain parts of so-called tradition that may not be acceptable, may not be applicable now, may be something that you may not do in your own life. So Islam encourages us, in fact, it orders us to have a type of intellect where we question things, where we're critical, where we think about things, right, and that we become convinced of things for ourselves. But in a manner that's appropriate, right? It doesn't mean that, you know, nowadays people's idea of criticism is kind of to completely disparage and take apart that object of criticism. We don't say it necessarily like this, but in an informed manner, an appropriate manner, one becomes sort of, you know, the thing that you believe in, or the thing that you hold to be true, you hold it to be true because you're convinced of it. And there are certain pathways to become convinced, right? There are certain epistemologies, to use a big word, that tells you, I know this thing to be true or this thing to not be true. I accept this statement or I don't accept this statement. And Islam is not telling you to throw that aside and just have blind faith. There's no blind faith. It's a faith based upon you having Iman, and Iman means tasdeeq. Iman means holding something to be true. So just as this table looks to be in front of you guys, and I'm sitting on this chair on a Tuesday night, and we think that's true, then we have to think anything that pertains to my belief, to our religion, also is true in the same way. That level of conviction. It's not enough to say, yeah, it's probably true. You know, I'll just be a believer, and then, you know, when I die and then I'm asked those 3 questions, if it's probably true, then I don't lose anything, right? If it's not, that's not Iman. Iman means you have a solid conviction about it. So that means that Islam is not just a bunch of inherited traditions. Islam is principles and values. And you have to be convinced of those principles and values. Right? It's not enough to say that I learned it from here, got it from there, or this sheikh, or this person, or that country. No, I believe in this principle. I believe in the principle of Tawheed, that this whole creation could have come only from one source. It's not a multiple deity. It's not random. I can't believe that, because it doesn't make sense. What makes sense to me is Tawheed, that this came from a single supreme being and creator. That level of conviction. And then all the principles that come out of that. Prophet ﷺ was sent to us as a mercy to all mankind. He showed us how to be merciful to one another, how to love one another, how to build beautiful societies. I believe in those principles. That's what I believe in. And if you believe it on that standard, by taking the principles and values and looking at them and saying, do these things make sense to you, judge Islam by that. Don't judge Islam by a lot of the other stuff that people are running around saying. Because unfortunately we live in a very confusing time. People have kind of grabbed Islam and use it to justify everything. From throwing acid in a woman's face to blowing up streets and planes and whatever nonsense other people have been using Islam, when Islam is bari. Islam is completely innocent of all of this. But people use it. So go to the source, go to the Quran, go to the Sunnah, go to the people who truly embody the Quran and Sunnah. Judge for yourself. So during this time, now the Prophet ﷺ is openly inviting people to Islam. And we see the type of people who actually came to Islam in the beginning were those, remember, as we said last week, Mecca was a tribal society. And if a tribe didn't have your back, then no one had your back. You're in a lot of trouble. If you were an outsider, if you came from somewhere else, like Suhaib al-Rumi or Salman al-Farisi, you can easily find yourself into slavery. People will just sell you into slavery because you had no tribe to have your back. If you were a newcomer to Mecca, to the town, before you enter, right, if nobody knows you, you have to go in under the patronage of somebody. well known. Right? They called it jiwar or mujawara. So I'm going in under the protection of this person or that person, or, I'm not just, you don't just show up at the central Mecca train station and hail a cab and, take me to the nearest hotel. Unless you have protection, unless you have some type of system to help you when you're coming in, you'll be in a lot of trouble. So a lot of the people who came into Islam in the beginning, what were called al-mustad'afin, those who were not very prominent people in society. They were not the movers and shakers. They were the type of people who might have been ex-slaves or still slaves. They were downtrodden, disenfranchised type of people who early on came into Islam. None of the Quraysh chieftains, the very prominent people, were early adopters of Islam. In fact, the only Quraysh chieftain to accept Islam, because the others either perished in one of the battles or died some other way, was Abu Sufyan. The rest of them didn't make it that far. So, this is something that's kind of a sunnah kawniyya. It's kind of a sunnah that Allah puts into creation. That always the early adopters of Iman, of faith, are those who are the downtrodden, the disenfranchised. Al-mustad'afin fil ard. One might ask, well, that's because they got nothing to lose. All the other ones, they have a lot of dunya and a lot of interest. If they were to lose and to take Islam up, and then they lose their income from the idol worship and the pilgrimage and stuff like that, and lose their position in society, well, that's a lot to lose. So they were kind of slower to adopt. That's valid. But at the same time, there's a amil nafsi, there's a spiritual aspect to this as well. And that is when someone is in possession of much material wealth or accumulation of material wealth, they have less of a tendency to see themselves as in need of anything. They think they're self-sufficient. They don't think they need anything, right? If you're doing okay and you have a lot of material wealth and money is no object for you, you kind of think, well, I don't need anything. I don't need this religion because I'm doing great. What do I need that for? Whereas someone who is in a lesser position, they're actually closer to the fitrah, closer to the natural state of the believer, right? Which is namely your faqir. And faqir doesn't mean poor person, it means person in need. And you are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu al-ghani wa antum al-fuqara ilay. Allah is the one who is completely self-sufficient, not in need of anything, and you're the one who is in need. And so the paradigm in Islam is your level of need is not based upon how much you materially possess, but it's how wealthy you are with the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you are sufficient with Allah's knowledge of you, then you don't need anything, because you know you only need Him. Then you become the richest of the people, right? Because the person who has a lot but still wants more is in a state of poverty, because they're always looking for more. They're always in need. They're never satiated. Whereas the person who may have little but is content and satisfied even with the little that they do have, they are the ones who are people of wealth, people of spiritual wealth. So, in the prophetic reports, that's why that the true wealth is the wealth of the spirit, not the wealth of the hand, of what you possess. So, many of the downtrodden came to Islam in the beginning. We see this theme occurring in the Quran. The people who followed the Prophet Nuh, for example, they were described as aradhil al-qawm. Aradhil, yani the lowest of the low. You have only the low people following you. You don't have really... Fir'aun picked upon the people that followed Moses, saying that they're shirzimatun qalilun. Shirzima, yani this small little group that's insignificant, marginalized, they don't have any power, so forth. So there was a period of idha', there was a period of a lot of strife and actual punishment coming from the more prominent members of the society. And in the beginning they tried to do it a little bit more in a negotiating style. So they would approach the Prophet ﷺ and they would say to him, look, you're one of us, you're one of our sons, we get it, but If you need a doctor, we'll get you a doctor. If you need, if it's money you're after, we'll give you all the money. If it's women you're after, we'll give you women, the best of our women. If it's a kingdom, you want to be in charge, okay, we can live with that. But stop preaching this thing. And of course the Prophet ﷺ refused. So you might say, well, what if he accepted the kingdom thing, right? It could have been a way for him to get in charge, and then a way to spread the da'wah, right? That makes sense, get in charge, be on top, and then over time, they can do that. But the Prophet ﷺ didn't accept that. They came to him and they said, look, let's compromise. We'll worship your God 1 year and you worship our God 1 year. We'll alternate. And that's how قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ came about. لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ. Right? We don't worship what you worship. The Prophet didn't accept that either, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason he didn't is because we have a principle that the means are honorable, as are the goals or the objectives. So there's no ends justifying the means. The means themselves are important, and they must be honorable, and they must be principled. So we don't take dishonorable means, unprincipled means, even to seemingly achieve something that we think is an objective, that's honorable. It doesn't make sense. You cannot get to ma'ruf, to what's honorable and principled and good, except with ma'ruf, except which is honored and principled. So he didn't take any of the deals that they were throwing at him, that they wanted to do for him. None of them. And so we should take this as a lesson, that some things might entice us. It might make a lot of sense. Oh, look, if we're in charge of this, we're in charge of that. We might have to bend the truth a little bit, but we'll be in charge. And then we can, then we'll do the things that's right, but just let's get us in that position. It's not going to work. It's not an honorable thing, because we are commanded, right? It's an act of worship itself and the means that we take, not just the goals or the ends that we're seeking. And at the end of the day, the goals and the ends, you have no control over them. You seek them. Whether you achieve them or not, it's not up to you. That's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So really our ibadah is about the means. It's not about the ends. Right? Because the ends is not in our possession. The ends is not in our power. So if we seek the right means, the proper means, the appropriate means, the principled means, whether Allah gives us the ends after that or not is not our issue. But we did what we were supposed to do. And that was the way of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So even some of the some of the old Orientalist literature, they'll say that really Muhammad ﷺ, he was kind of an Arab king, he wanted to be that, and so he used this da'wah as a way to, well, if that were the case, he could have taken it from right here. If he really wanted that, and if it was about money and about influence and about power and about sovereignty, he would have taken the deal they gave him in the beginning. And if it was about the Arabs becoming this prominent world power, because they weren't before that, the Persians and the Byzantines didn't think anything of the Arabian Peninsula, they was just some backwater to them that didn't have any significance, then the Arab chieftains of Quraysh, they would have been on board with that project, right? Because they love power, they love nufuth, they love to be in charge, they love to have influence. They would have taken that. So it wasn't about that. His mission, his da'wah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was about reaching people's hearts, changing people's hearts, making someone from a person who was a slave to himself to a slave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or a slave to his desires, or a slave to others, to a slave to God. That's the transformation. That's what the whole da'wah, the mission was about. So they went under a period of heavy strife. The weaker people, in terms weaker in sense of they didn't have someone to have their back, suffered the worst. Some were actually even killed. The Prophet himself did not escape this idah, even though Abu Talib was his patron and protector, and Abu Talib was a strong, prominent, one of the chiefs of Quraysh. But even that was not enough, because they knew that they couldn't actually do serious physical harm to him, because then they would have the tribe of Banu Hashim after them. But they would do things that were like trying to humiliate him. He would be praying in the Kaaba sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he'd be in sujood, and they would bring camel entrails, put it on his back. And it was Fatima, his young daughter, would come and take it off his back, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Or he would be going to walk around the Kaaba and they would pull him by his collar so hard that they were almost suffocating him. And it was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq who said to them, أَتَقْتُلُونَ رَجُلًا يَكُونُ رَبِّي اللَّهِ? You're trying to kill someone just because he said, my God is Allah? That's what this is about. So all sorts of despicable things happened, not just to the Prophet ﷺ, but also to many of the other Sahaba. This culminated in, after they tried the negotiations, they tried to negotiate with the Prophet himself, they tried to negotiate with Abu Talib. They went to Abu Talib and they said, look, your son, your nephew here is causing us a lot of problems. We have a deal for you. We'll give you one of our sons. He could be like your nephew, right? And he can take care of things for you, and then, just leave us. He said back to them, so you want me to take one of your sons and raise him and spend money on him, and then you take mine to kill him? What type of deal is that? So he refused outright. And even Abu Talib one time approached the Prophet ﷺ and asked him sort of in an indirect way. The Prophet ﷺ took it as like, oh wait, maybe he's changing his mind. And that's when he said the very famous thing, if you put the sun in one hand and the moon in the other, I would not leave this da'wah. And then Abu Talib promised him, said, I would never forsake you. And I am with you. And Abu Talib even encouraged his sons to follow the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So Ali and Ja'far became Muslim. And Aqil later on became Muslim. So the idea of then Abu Talib, how did he die then? So it's recorded that he, in the Seerah, that he didn't actually ever say the Shahadateen. That he did not say La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. But it seemed like his actions, in the way that he supported the Prophet ﷺ, even more than some of the people who did say the Shahada, seems to be a witness for him. And yet there's some other reports that point that he will be in hellfire. So how do we reconcile all of that? There's two major opinions. One says that since he did not say the Shahada, testification of faith, during his lifetime, and if we consider that to be part of Iman, part and parcel of Iman, then we would have to say that he did not die as a Muslim, and then he might reside in hell forever. The other opinion is that the talaffuz bi-shahadatain, saying the testification of faith, is an indicator of Iman. It's a condition of Iman for the legal rulings for believers to apply in this life. Not that it's going to have a bearing necessarily on the next life. So if we go by that, which is the opinion that our teachers lean to, then we could say that Abu Talib possibly will not spend eternity in hellfire. That he is a mu'min, a believer, but asi, a disobedient one for not saying the shahadateen during his life, and that he may eventually be released from hell. Again, there's nothing bearing upon that which one you believe, but know that both those opinions exist. So people who insist on certain things like you must believe that Abu Talib is in hell, and you must believe the parents of the Prophet ﷺ are in hell, astaghfirullah azim. Even if that were true, we had to accept that. Why would we even speak in that way? Right? If we had a non-Muslim friend and they came to you and they said, my parents died, where do you think they are? What are you going to say to them? Oh, they're in hell. I won't tell you, but tough luck. Sorry. You don't know where they are. The fact of the matter is you don't know where they are. The fact of the matter is Allah didn't burden us to know where they are. The fact of the matter is that unless you have a clear, definitive nas, a text from the Quran and Sunnah by name, not by attribute, by name of that person, you can't say they're in hell or in heaven. You cannot. Abu Lahab, okay, he's in hell. By name, his wife too. Anyone else? I don't know. Anyone who died last week or the week before, I don't know what was in their heart. I don't know if the dawah, they knew it. I don't know if they knew it enough to reject it. We can't know that. So the least you can do is to be silent. Cover your ignorance with your silence, as our ulama say. Ustur nafsak bis-sitr. Cover yourself, with your silence. So if someone asks you, what do you think? So you know what? Our religion doesn't burden us to know that. But I hope that they had a good outcome. I hope they had a good ending. And I hope maybe they didn't know enough about our deen, and I think if maybe they knew about it, they might have accepted it, but maybe they didn't know. So that's up to God, what He wants to do with them. That's not my business. When we do the tarahum, when we say, Fulan rahimahullah, Allah have mercy on their soul, it's a supplication, it's a dua. We're asking Allah to admit them to save them, to find salvation for them from the next life. That's all it is. But unless we have a clear-cut text by name, we can't say definitively. And Islam doesn't ask us to know or to say definitively anyway. We're not burdened with that. So we believe that the people of Ahl al-Fatrah, the people who were between the two prophets who did not receive the da'wah, they're people of paradise, which include the parents of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, because they did not receive the da'wah of Isa, who was the prophet before Muhammad 600 years earlier, nor did they live to the time until the Prophet ﷺ, he himself became a prophet. So, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. And we are not going to take people into account until we have sent for them a messenger. And that's our aqidah. So, going back to Abu Talib, the abuse that the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ underwent culminated in a boycott. What's it called? Al-Hasr, or a type of economic boycott. So the Quraysh, they got together, they said, look, our negotiations are failing, we've tried with him, we've tried with Abu Talib, we've even abused some of them to the point of death. They took Bilal radiallahu anhu and they put him in the Sahara, and they put this huge rock on his chest, and they wanted him to say something, and he said, Ahad, Ahad, Allah is one, until Abu Bakr came and bought him and released him, freed him. So they went through all types of abuse. And then it culminated, so they said, all of these things are failing us, we can't kill him, because if we do, then the blood of Bani Hashim, they will come after us. So that wasn't an option for them at that point. They weren't thinking about that. So they said, well, let's have an economic boycott. And they wrote this sahifa, this document, that outlined that the tribes, affiliated tribes of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which were Abdul Muttalib, Banu Abdul Muttalib and Banu Hashim, would undergo this boycott. They would not trade with them, they would not marry their daughters, they would not do anything with them. Caravans would come to town, who were, Ajanib, they were not from Quraysh, and they would do this type of auctioneering to make the price so high that no one of the two tribes that were affected can afford it. It got so bad that they would eat leaves, palm tree leaves. It got so bad that someone would walk on the ground and step on something soft and then pick it up and say, well, I'll eat it because I have nothing else to eat. That was how bad it got for them during that time. And this lasted for 3 years. So 3 years of complete boycott. And they were completely isolated in the Shab of Abdul Muttalib, which was a certain part of town of Abdul Muttalib, a certain area of town that they lived in. Until, the Arabs weren't all that bad. They had a lot of problems with them, but they had this idea of honor. And some of them got together and they said, you know what, this is not right. How could we eat and we're satiated and we're doing well, and our fellow brothers here don't have anything to eat? And the ones who were affected by this were not just the Muslims, were also the non-Muslims amongst the two tribes. So those two tribes of Banu Hashim or Banu Abdul Muttalib, the sub-tribes, Muslim and non-Muslim. And the non-Muslim ones stood firm with them because they saw it as a type of solidarity with someone who's of the same sub-tribe. And of course the Muslims were staying firm because they were with the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Lahab famously said, I'm not with them. So he didn't even have the shahama, the chivalry that even some of his fellow tribesmen had, where they stuck it out with the Prophet ﷺ and his uncle. So this lasted for 3 years. Some of them got together. They said, you know what, this is very abusive. This is not right. And then they started having a campaign, more or less, to say, let's lift the boycott. When this was happening, the Prophet ﷺ received wahi, revelation, that the sahifa that they wrote was completely rotted and eaten, except for the basmala they put at the top, Bismika Allahumma. But the rest of it was completely gone. And so it was at that point that that it was lifted. It was at this point that the boycott was lifted. And during the boycott, though, before it was lifted, it had gotten so bad for some people that the Prophet ﷺ made a suggestion to some of them. And he said, maybe it's time for some of you to leave. So the concept of hijrah, of leaving and going somewhere else. And he said there is a honorable Christian king in Abyssinia, what is now Ethiopia, and people in Sudan think it's Sudan, but it's probably Ethiopia, said, go to this honorable Christian king who had the title of Najashi. And he said, there you will find an honorable man, and you find people who treat you right, and who will not abuse you. And so amongst the most prominent people who went were Sayyidina Uthman, and Ruqayya, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, Abdullah ibn Zubair, who was the husband of Asma bint Abi Bakr, the daughter of Abu Bakr. So some of the prominent Sahaba went, and Ja'far ibn Abi Talib also went to Abyssinia, and that meant crossing the Red Sea, which was kind of a big deal too, because going across the ocean was considered something that you would only do under very dire circumstances. It was not an easy thing. They didn't have these big mast ships, you know, Carnival cruise liner that can take them across, but they were things that could have very easily drowned in the water. But nevertheless, they went. When the Quraysh learned of this, they said, wait a minute, if he makes an alliance with a powerful kingdom like the kingdom of Ethiopia, that's not good for us. We don't want that. So they sent two emissaries. One was by the name of Abdullah ibn Rabi'ah, and another by the name of Amr ibn al-As, who later became Muslim, as we know. So they went after them. And they brought all sorts of gifts and all sorts of things and trinkets and things like this for the Christian king and Najashi. And they said, these people, they left us and they left our tribe and they left our custom, and they, they disparage us and our way of life, and now you're giving them sanctuary here. So the Najashi, upon hearing this, he summoned them immediately. He said, bring them, I want to hear what's the story with this. So they elected Ja'far, radiallahu anhu, as the spokesperson. And so he asked him, what is it what has brought you here? And he said, before we were worshiping idols and we were doing despicable things and we weren't treating people right, and then we came to this religion and now we have people of principle and honor and so forth. And he told them the whole thing. And then Najashi was satisfied. But then either Amr ibn al-As or Abdullah ibn Rabi'ah, they said, well, ask him about Jesus. So they already had an idea what the Quran was saying. And they had an idea that Christians, some of them believed in the Trinity. So he wanted to kind of trip him up with this one. So Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, he recited some verses from Surah Maryam. And upon hearing this, and Najashi said, what has come in this book, in this revelation, is the same that came to Jesus. They're brothers. I don't see any difference between the two. And so he ordered that the two emissaries from Quraysh were to be returned and to leave, and they left. And so the Sahaba in Ethiopia remained for a time. There was a rumor during the time that they were there, a number of years, that the people of Mecca all of them become Muslim. So some of them went back, about 33 of the men. There were about 80 men and some 9, 10 women. So about 33 of the men went back, and when they found out it wasn't true, some of them were actually captured by the Quraysh. Some of them had to seek the protection of someone, of a tribesman, so that they would not be harmed. But they actually didn't come back, all of them, until Khaybar, which was a few years after the Hijrah. So they stayed there for some years. So to finish off, just to the point of the Hijrah, we see that the Prophet ﷺ gave them an outlet, gave them something to get out of the situation that they were in. And it was based not upon something that was about their material comfort per se. Well, that wasn't the issue, right? Because the other Sahaba remained, but it was more about something pertaining to their deen. So whenever there's a fitna, a trial and tribulation in your religion, what does that mean, trial and tribulation in your religion? It means that the balance of you actually remaining and following the faith or performing the devotional acts of the faith becomes into question. Maybe, maybe not. This is when they made the decision that they do the hijrah. And it was a type of sunnah, right? The bigger hijrah came later to Medina, but the lesser hijrah, the first hijrah, to Ethiopia. And so the general principle about leaving where you're at, there are certain conditions that should be fulfilled. If you're leaving where you're at, that means that there's a strong reason for it. And one of the strong reasons is that you're worried about your deen. And that's why the Sahaba left when they left. either to Ethiopia or later on to Al-Medina. And so all of their life's decisions were based upon, well, is my deen going to be stronger? Stay here or I go there? Or could it possibly a better practice of the deen? Am I under threat in this particular place or not? Am I able to practice my deen in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded me to do so while I'm here or not? That was the basis of their decisions, of them leaving or going. And it was very difficult for them to leave. You know, imagine this is the only place they've known their whole life. And they're going somewhere where they don't even speak the language, right? They didn't even speak Arabic, they spoke Ethiopian, which is a similar language, but it's not the same. Different religion, different customs, different everything. But they went nonetheless. So in our own lives, the concept of hijrah, there's a spiritual hijrah, and then there's the more physical hijrah. Just like when we saw the spiritual seclusion and the physical seclusion with the Prophet ﷺ, the idea of hijrah also. And some of the hadith point to the spiritual hijrah. Right? The spiritual hijrah is al-muhajir man hajar al-ma'asi, right? That the true emigrant is the one who emigrates from his sins, to leave those aside. So there's an indication here that if you're emigrating so as not to fall into sin and to be a better practitioner of your faith, then that's a valid reason to consider when you're thinking about going from one place to the next. And the Arabs, they have a saying, they say, الرفيق قبل الطريق والجار قبل الدار. So الرفيق قبل الطريق means your traveling companion before you hit the road. والجار قبل الدار, and your neighbor before the house. There used to be a time when people, when they're looking for an apartment to rent or a house to buy, they were kind of concerned what the neighbors were doing. Who are the neighbors? Will we get along with them? Nowadays people don't really care about that because you don't have a relationship with your neighbor. Most people don't know who their neighbor is. They don't know the person lives downstairs or the person lives across the street or their name or anything like that. And they don't care. But there used to be a time when people were very much communities, and they had, in this country, not so long ago, 20, 30 years ago, people were concerned who their neighbors were. Because they understood that that will have more an effect on their life and in the way that they practice their life than how many square feet the basement has. But who the neighbors are, the neighborhood, right? The relationships I'm going to form with these people. Because now, these people that I move next to, they have rights on me. The Prophet ﷺ said, مَا زَالَ جِبْرِيلُ يُوَصِّينِي فِي الْجَارِ حَتَّى ظَنَنْتُ أَنَّهُ سَيُوَرِّثُهُ. He said, Jibreel was telling me so much about the neighbor and rights of the neighbor until I thought he would make him an heir. An heir, and an inheritor, someone to inherit my estate. That's how close and important the neighbor is. So the idea of hijrah, living physically, means that you're doing it to improve the practice, your ability to practice your faith. And that's what they did in the beginning here. So our ulama, they say it's still a type of hijrah. People can travel for various reasons, for business, for study, for anything. But ultimately, when you're thinking about how to settle, where to settle, what to do, the main consideration should be your deen. The main concern should be, maybe should I move next to these people? Should I move into this community? Should I move in this particular place because I have a better practice of my deen? Not because the Walmart is walking distance, or whatever reason people move into neighborhoods. So I think we've outrun our time. We will stop here, inshallah.